Every family in this small hill village of perhaps 200 to 400 souls understood, with a deep and intimate certainty, that water had to be earned, pulled from the earth, carried on the back, stored with care, and never, under any circumstance, wasted. Nazareth sat on the edge of the Jezreel Valley, in the limestone hills of Lower Galilee. Rain came only in the winter months, roughly from October through March, and then the sky closed like a sealed jar. For the remaining half of the year, the land baked. The soil cracked into pale plates. The air turned dry as fired clay, carrying the faint mineral taste of dust wherever it moved. To survive this seasonal drought, families relied on two primary sources. The first was the village spring, a single communal source known today as Mary's Well, though in antiquity it was simply the well, the center of morning life. Women and older children made the walk there each day, carrying ceramic jugs balanced on their heads or pressed against their hips. A full jug weighed nearly 20 kilograms. The walk to the spring, the wait in line among neighbors, the careful walk back, this was not a chore. It was the heartbeat of the village day. The second source was the cistern. Cut directly into the bedrock beneath or beside the home, the cistern was a private underground reservoir, a carved chamber sealed with plaster that collected rainwater from rooftops and courtyard channels during the wet months, and held it cool and dark for the dry months ahead. Archaeologists working across ancient Galilean sites have found these cisterns throughout the region, evidence of a people who had turned the management of scarcity into an art. But even a full cistern ran low by late summer, and when it ran low, the family chose. Cooking came before cleaning, drinking came before washing, and washing the body, truly washing, could wait. The body could always wait. The meal was almost ready. You could smell it. Lentils simmering low in a clay pot, a thread of olive oil catching the heat, dried herbs releasing their faint bitterness into the air of the small courtyard. But before anyone sat down, before a single piece of flatbread was torn and shared, there was a ritual that could not be delayed, could not be skipped, could not be negotiated away: the washing of hands. In first-century Jewish practice, hand-washing before meals was not simply a matter of hygiene. It was a religious act, a deliberate boundary drawn between the contaminated world outside and the sacred act of eating, of nourishing the body that God had given. The tradition ran deep, drawing from the same source as the entire Levitical purity system. The belief that impurity that's contracted through contact with the dead, with certain animals, with bodily discharge, with the soil and crowds of the marketplace, could transfer, could move from surface to surface, could render a person ritually unfit. The practice was precise. Water was poured over one hand, then the other, from a vessel held deliberately, not immersed, but poured, allowing the water to run down to at least the wrist. The hands were then rubbed together and dried. The water used had to be clean and gathered intentionally. The vessel used had to be made of stone, not clay, because stone, according to rabbinic interpretation, could not contract ritual impurity. These stone vessels, small and functional, have been recovered by archaeologists across Galilean sites in striking quantities, silent evidence of a people organizing daily life around this invisible but absolute requirement. In a household like the one in Nazareth where Jesus grew up, this act happened multiple times across the day, before eating, after returning from the market, after touching objects of uncertain status, after contact with the busy, unpredictable human world that surrounded every trip beyond the courtyard gate. And yet, this water still came from the same precious store, the same cistern, the same morning trip to the well. Every ritual act of washing drew from a supply that was never entirely secure. The law demanded cleanliness, the earth demanded rationing. And between these two demands, every family in Nazareth navigated each day with the same quiet tension. Clean hands were one thing, the rest of the body was an entirely different question. It settled on the eyelashes and gathered in the creases of the neck. It worked its way into the folds of the tunic where the fabric pressed against the skin. It mixed with sweat along the spine and across the shoulders and formed a thin, gritty paste that dried in the heat and cracked when the body moved. In Nazareth, in the long months of summer, the air itself seemed composed of dry heat and fine limestone powder, lifted by a wind that offered movement but no relief. Jesus grew up, according to the gospel accounts, in a household where the primary trade was that of a tekton, a Greek word typically translated as carpenter, but which more accurately described a craftsman who worked with both wood and stone. This was physical, outdoor, grinding work, cutting and shaping timber, fitting stone, carrying heavy materials across uneven ground beneath a sun that offered no sympathy. By the end of such a working day, the body bore the full record of its labor. Hands were calloused, stained with resin or stone dust, scraped across the knuckles. The tunic, a single piece of rough woven linen or wool worn close against the skin, was soaked through and stiff with dried sweat. The sandals, strapped leather against bare feet, had accumulated the full grit of every path and courtyard walk that day. Dust, animal dung, debris from the road. There was no shower waiting at the end of this day, no basin filled and ready. What existed was a ceramic jar, a small measure of water, carefully rationed, and a rough cloth. The body was wiped down rather than washed. Water was too scarce for full immersion in daily life. A damp cloth drawn deliberately across the face, the neck, the arms, and especially the feet, which received particular attention, caked with road dust and the unavoidable waste of the unpaved lanes connecting village to field to market. Parasites were a constant, unremarked part of this life. Intestinal worms spread through contaminated water and food. Lice and fleas moved through households and through the clothing that was rarely fully washed. These were not exceptional misfortunes. They were the background noise of bodily life in the ancient world, managed as best they could be and otherwise endured. The heat always came back, and the dust always settled again. Cut into the bedrock beneath the village, plastered smooth with waterproof lime, fed by channels that gathered rainwater from the rooftops and directed it underground, untouched by human hands. Cool, even in summer, dark except for the light admitted from above. This was the mikveh, and it was not a luxury. It was a necessity as fundamental to Jewish life in this century as the well, the bread oven, or the Sabbath lamp. The mikveh, the ritual immersion pool, was one of the defining features of any observant Jewish community in the first century. Archaeologists have recovered them throughout Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem, carved into living stone beneath homes, beside synagogues, cut into the foundations of public buildings. Their dimensions were governed by religious law with exact precision, deep enough to fully submerge the entire body, holding a minimum of 40 seas of gathered water, roughly 500 liters, collected from a natural source rather than drawn by human hand. The occasions demanding immersion were many, woven throughout the calendar of ordinary life. A woman completed her menstrual period. Immersion was required before resuming full marital and communal life. A man experienced a nocturnal immersion before morning prayers, contact with a corpse, unavoidable in a world where the dead were washed and buried by family, rendered a person impure for 7 days. Certain skin conditions, certain animals. The list was long, specific, and inescapable. Descending into the mikveh was a physical act of radical completeness. The stone steps, worn smooth by repeated use, led down into water that closed over the entire body at once. Nothing could be shielded from contact. No pinned hair, no sandal strap, no part of the skin. The immersion had to be total and simultaneous, the whole body enveloped in the gathered rain that the law considered living water. Rising from the pool, the body emerged unchanged in appearance. The same skin, the same hands, the same dust waiting on the steps above. But something had been formally reset. A status restored, a boundary recrossed, a return to full participation in the life of the community made possible. And yet, the water in the mikveh accumulated over time. It was replenished by rain, not replaced by fresh water. Ritual purity and physical cleanliness were not the same thing. They never had been. And in Nazareth, beneath the Galilean sky, they negotiated with each other every single day. The man stood at the edge of the road, at the place where the village path met the open field, where the boundary between community and exile had been drawn and maintained for as long as anyone could remember. He did not approach. He understood what was required of him. His outer garment was torn at the collar, the mark prescribed by Levitical law for his condition. His hair, uncut and loose, fell across his face. His voice, when it came, was raised in the call that every traveler on every road in Judea and Galilee learned to recognize from childhood. Unclean, unclean. Skin disease in first-century Jewish society was not merely a medical condition. It was a legal verdict, a social sentence, and a theological classification simultaneously. The term rendered in ancient translations as leprosy, zaraat in Hebrew, covered a wide range of visible conditions affecting the skin or clothing: psoriasis, vitiligo, severe fungal infections, advanced eczema, and others that left marks on the body's surface. A priest, not a physician, was responsible for examination and diagnosis. If the condition matched the descriptions in Leviticus, the verdict was declared and the consequences were immediate. Exclusion from the village, exclusion from the mikveh, exclusion from the synagogue, the communal meal, the family household. The excluded person was required to live outside the inhabited boundaries of the community for the duration of the condition, which might be weeks, might be months, might be the rest of a life. Readmission required a second priestly examination, ritual washing, specific offerings at the temple. The process was long, uncertain, and administered without sentiment. This was not cruelty isolated from its context. It was a public health structure built into a religious framework, in a world that had no understanding of contagion at the microscopic level, no means of distinguishing between infectious and non-infectious conditions, and no recourse beyond separation. The fear was ancient, rational within its limits, and encoded into the law at its deepest levels. But the human cost was total. The excluded person lost everything simultaneously: home, family, livelihood, ritual standing, identity within the only community they had ever known. In a village as small as Nazareth, this loss was not abstract. It was visible from every corner of every street. The line between clean and unclean was never as stable as the law suggested. It was drawn in human skin, in a body that the sun and the dust and the water were always already working to compromise. At the end of the day, when the light over Galilee turned amber and the limestone walls of Nazareth held the last warmth of the sun before releasing it to the cooling air of evening, the village settled into its closing rituals. Water jars were sealed and set against the wall. The courtyard fire was banked. Sandals were set at the threshold. The feet that had walked the road carried the weight, gathered the dust of the day left to rest at the border between outside and in. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the quiet, ordinary closing of a day that had demanded everything the body had to give, the question that ran beneath every act of washing, every immersion, every poured vessel and carried jug still hovered in the air, unanswered and essential. What does it mean to be clean? In first century Galilee, this question was never abstract. It was answered every day in stone and water, in rope and clay, in the walk to the well and the descent into the mikveh. Purity was not an idea held at a comfortable distance. It was a practice, a discipline that had to be performed with the hands, with the body, against the resistance of a landscape that offered too little water and too much heat and dust. The young man who grew up in this village, who carried ceramic jars from the well, who washed his hands before every meal from a stone vessel kept specifically for that purpose, who wiped the stone dust and wood resin of the carpenter's work from his skin at the end of each long day, who knew the weight of a full water jug and the relief of cool water against cracked and calloused hands. Unders stood something that no amount of theological instruction could fully convey. The body was not separate from the spirit. It was the spirit's address. It was where the spirit lived, worked, suffered, and was restored. To care for the body, to wash it with water that had to be earned, to purify it in a pool that gathered rain from the sky, to acknowledge its vulnerability to disease and heat and the relentless accumulation of daily grime, was itself a form of spiritual attention. Not because the water was magical, but because the intention behind the water was deliberate. In a world of profound scarcity, choosing to stop, to pour, to honor the line between clean and unclean, this was a form of reverence that required no grand gesture. It required only the discipline to show up again and again in a body that the world was always working to soil. Especially here, in the dust and the heat and the relentless ordinary life of a small village that history almost forgot.